He grabbed the tray right out of her hands and threw it across the floor. Charts scattered. A water cup shattered. And Sergeant Logan Tex Ramirez leaned back against his hospital pillow, grinning like he had just done something funny. "Pick it up, princess," he said. Every Marine in that ward laughed. The quiet nurse said nothing. She bent down, gathered every piece off that cold floor, and walked back to the supply cart without a single word. Nobody in that room knew who she really was, and that was exactly the point. Before this night was over, that same quiet nurse would be the only thing standing between every single one of those men and a professional kill team. Welcome. If this is your first time here, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The ward smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, the particular combination that never quite left your nose no matter how many hours you had been walking those floors. Emily Carter had been on shift since 5 in the morning, and by the time the afternoon light faded against the frosted windows of Ward 7 at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, she had replaced 11 IV bags, redressed 4 wound sites, fielded 3 complaints about the food, and endured more mockery than most people receive in an entire year of working. She was used to it by now, or at least she had learned to look like she was used to it. Ward 7 housed recovering Marines, most of them back from overseas deployments, most of them carrying injuries that ranged from shrapnel wounds to surgical reconstructions that had taken teams of doctors 8 and 10 hours to complete. They were young men mostly, loud, restless, bored out of their minds, and not particularly interested in making life easy for the nursing staff. Emily was 29 years old. She stood 5 feet 6 inches with a narrow frame that made her look smaller than she was. She wore her dark hair pulled back tight, no makeup, plain blue scrubs. She moved quietly and kept her head down and rarely offered an opinion on anything. To the men in Ward 7, she looked exactly like what they assumed she was. A brand new nurse, maybe fresh out of school, probably in over her head, definitely not ready for a room full of hard men with sharp edges. The nickname had come on her 3rd day. Sergeant Ramirez had given it to her. He was a big man, 26 years old, 2 tours and currently recovering from a femur fracture and a partial knee reconstruction that had him furious at the world and looking for somewhere to aim it. He had a loud voice and an audience that laughed at everything he said, and on her 3rd morning, he had watched her drop a box of sterile gloves and scramble to pick them up, and he had grinned over at the man in the next bed and said loud enough for the whole room to hear, "They're sending us Princess Nurse." The name stuck. Look, immediately, "Princess Nurse, can you do something about this pillow?" "Princess Nurse, this IV is beeping again." "Princess Nurse, you look like you've never seen a real injury in your life." She never snapped back. She never flinched visibly. She just did her job, answered their questions, adjusted their pillows, silenced their alarms, and moved to the next task. A few of the other nurses on the floor tried to sympathize with her in the break room, offering the kind of tired solidarity that comes from people who have survived the same thing. "Ramirez is the worst one," said Nurse Dana Cho, pouring herself a 3rd cup of coffee on a Tuesday afternoon, dark circles under her eyes. "He drove out the last 2. Just ignore him." "I'm not bothered," Emily said. Dana looked at her carefully. "You're either tougher than you look or you're still in shock. Give it another week." Emily smiled at her and said nothing more. What Dana did not know, what none of them knew, was that Emily Carter had spent 4 years operating in environments where a bad day meant something considerably worse than a rude patient. She had trained in conditions designed to make people quit, in places where the temperature cracked 45 degrees Celsius and the water ran out before the mission did. She had been through selection processes that broke men twice her size. She had operated in classified programs that did not officially exist under names that were not her own in countries whose governments would have denied her presence entirely. The ward was loud, but it was not dangerous. Ramirez was unpleasant, but he was not a threat. She could endure this in her sleep. The harder part, the genuinely difficult part, was making sure nobody in this hospital suspected any of that for even a moment. On the evening of her 9th day at Walter Reed, everything changed. She was finishing a chart at the nurse's station when she heard the elevator open at the end of the hall. That was not unusual. Patients were transferred at all hours. But something about the sound of the footsteps caught her attention, the particular rhythm of multiple people moving in close formation, the way weight shifted in a coordinated way that was not how orderlies or transport nurses moved. She did not look up from the chart. She turned a page slowly as if absorbed in documentation and used the reflection in the dark window above the station to watch the hallway behind her. 4 men, civilian clothes. 2 of them pushing a gurney with a patient strapped down, covered to the chin, face pale and tight with pain. The other 2 flanking the group at positions that were not medical. They were not there to help with the patient. They were there to watch the corridor. A hospital administrator Emily had not seen before accompanied them, clipboard in hand, talking quietly and quickly, the universal body language of someone who had been told to make this transfer happen without asking too many questions. They moved the patient into the room at the far end of the wardroom 12, which had been quietly emptied that afternoon. Emily had noted that at the time and filed it away without comment. The 2 men in tactical positions took up stations outside the door. The administrator came to the nurse's station 12 seconds later. His name tag said Coordinator Brent Merritt, but he handled it like it had just been issued that morning. The patient in room 12 is a federal matter, he said, keeping his voice low and professional. Standard vitals monitoring, nothing else. All documentation goes through me directly, not into the main system. Questions to be routed through the attending on call. No direct patient contact unless medically necessary. Emily looked up at him with the politely blank expression of a nurse being given instructions she has no particular feeling about. Of course, she said. What name do I use for the chart? Doe, John Doe. He held her gaze a half-second too long, checking her reaction. She gave him nothing to read. Got it, she said. She wrote it down. He nodded once and walked back toward the elevator. Emily watched him go in the window reflection, then looked back at her chart. Her heart rate had not changed. Her hands were perfectly steady, but something had clicked into place behind her eyes, some quiet internal system that had been idling for 9 days and had just received a signal. She finished the chart and moved on to room 6, where a lance corporal named Martinez needed his wound dressing changed and was deeply unhappy about it. Easy, she said quietly as she began to work. It's not easy, it feels like fire, he said through gritted teeth. I know. Breathe out. He breathed out. She worked quickly and cleanly, her hands moving with an efficiency that she was careful never to let look like anything other than good training. Not special, not unusual, just a competent nurse who had clearly practiced this enough times to be smooth at it. You're better at this than the last one, Martinez admitted grudgingly when she finished. Thank you, she said. That's not a compliment to you? The last one was terrible. She almost smiled for real that time. She was moving past room 12 on her way back to the station when she heard it barely audible through the door, a voice rough with pain and something under it that was not quite fear, but was very close to it. She paused with her hand raised as if she was about to knock for a routine check, made eye contact with the guard on the left, and said, "Vitals check." He looked at her for a moment, then stepped aside without speaking. She opened the door. The man on the bed was 40-something, heavy-set face, deeply weathered by outdoor work in hard climates. His right arm was in a full cast. There was a bandaged wound high on his left shoulder. He had the eyes of someone who had been awake for a very long time and was using willpower to stay alert because he did not feel safe enough to sleep. Emily moved to the vitals monitor, began checking readings with her back partly turned to the door in a way that made her look occupied and harmless. Daniel Kincaid, she said very quietly without looking at him. She had not been told his name. She said it anyway. She heard the sharp intake of breath. Who are you? He said. His voice was almost no volume at all. I'm the nurse, she said simply. A long pause. She kept her eyes on the monitor. Those men outside, he said, they're not federal. I know, she said, another pause. She could feel him recalibrating, trying to calculate what she meant, whether she was safe. They're going to come tonight, he said finally. Whoever sent them to position those men outside my door, they're sending more. Real ones, people who don't wear the badge they gave those to. Emily wrote something on the chart, a blood pressure reading, normal numbers. How many, she said. I don't know. Enough to do it clean and leave fast. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Not from weakness, from the specific kind of fear that comes from knowing exactly how these things go, because you have been on the other side of them. Okay, Emily said. She capped her pen, gave the monitor one final look, and turned toward the door. That's it, he said. Okay. She looked back at him once briefly. Get some rest, she said. You're going to need it. She walked back out into the corridor. The guards watched her return to the station. She picked up a chart, sat down, and began writing. For the next 40 minutes, she was the picture of a quiet nurse at the end of a long shift. She answered a call from Ramirez about his pain medication timing with her usual mild patience. She coordinated a supply request with the overnight pharmacist. She chatted briefly with Dana about weekend plans. And in the part of her mind that never really went quiet, she was doing something else entirely. She was walking every hallway of this floor from memory, every junction, every closet and supply room and maintenance access point. She was counting the guards and tracking their rotation pattern. She was cataloging what was available in the supply rooms, the medication carts, the emergency equipment stations. She was calculating distances and angles and times. She was doing what she had been trained to do. She was preparing for what was coming. It was at the 2-hour mark after Kincaid's arrival that Sergeant Ramirez, bored and restless and probably genuinely in some pain, despite not wanting to admit it, wheeled his chair to the doorway of his room and called across the ward. "Princess Nurse, what time does the good stuff kick in?" Several of the other Marines were still awake, the ones who slept badly from pain or the mental residue of things they did not talk about in polite company. There were 12 patients in Ward 7 that night. 2 were asleep. The other 10 were variously reading, staring at ceiling tiles, watching things on phones, with earbuds in or doing what Ramirez was doing, which was making the fact of his presence known. Emily walked over to his doorway. "Your next dose is in 90 minutes, she said. "That's a long time," he said. She agreed. "You could just give me a little extra." "I won't do that." He looked at her with that particular expression. He had the one that was performing confidence for the room, but underneath it was just a young man in pain and frustration who had been lying in a bed for weeks and felt the walls closing in. "Why do you even work here?" he said. "You look scared every single minute of every shift. This place is going to eat you alive, and you know it." Emily looked at him for a long moment without speaking. There were about 15 different things she could have said in that moment. She thought of none of them as options. Instead, she said simply, "Your vitals are good. 90 minutes. She turned and walked back to the station. Behind her, she heard Ramirez say to no one in particular, "I'd give her 2 more weeks." She sat back down, picked up the chart, kept her breathing even. Outside the windows, the Maryland evening had gone fully dark. Somewhere in this building, Kincaid was lying awake in room 12 counting the minutes. And somewhere outside this building, people with weapons and a specific set of instructions were making their final preparations. Emily Carter picked up her pen. She had 90 minutes, give or take. She intended to use every one of them. Ramirez fell asleep eventually, which surprised her because she had privately calculated he would stay awake and complaining until at least midnight out of sheer stubbornness. But the pain medication he had received earlier in the evening caught up with him around 10:30, and she could see through the window of his room that his head had dropped to one side and his breathing had slowed. She did a final round of the ward, 12 patients. The 2 in the deepest sleep were at the far end. The 10 awake, or half awake, were distributed through the middle rooms and Ramirez's room at the near end. Room 12 at the far end, with its 2 false federal guards and its frightened witness. She pulled the crash cart 2 feet to the left at the hallway junction and then pushed it back, looking at it as if she had simply been checking that it moved freely. She checked the supply closet near room 8 and confirmed the shelves held what she remembered them holding. She tested the door to the maintenance access corridor and found it unlocked. She left it unlocked. She walked back to the nurse's station and sat down. She thought about calling it in. She had a number. She had always had a number. It had been given to her before she came to this hospital in the same quiet briefing, where she had been given the name Emily Carter and the nursing credentials and the cover story. Call if there is a credible threat. Call if the situation escalates beyond plausible containment. She thought about what would happen if she called right now. A scramble of assets and federal response and a full evacuation. And quite possibly, Kincaid moved to a less secured location in the chaos of the response, which was exactly the scenario these people might be banking on: flush him out of the fixed position, take him in transit. She thought about the 12 patients in this ward, the wounded men who had come home carrying injuries they would spend years recovering from. She thought about Ramirez asleep in his chair with his leg propped up on a pillow, looking about 16 years old when he was not performing. She did not make the call, not yet. The lights went out at 11:47. Not a flicker, not a gradual dimming. The total immediate blackness of a deliberately cut power source. Emergency lighting kicked in 3 seconds later, casting everything in the dim red-orange of battery backup systems, the kind of light that makes walls look like they are bleeding. Emily was already on her feet before the emergency lights came on. From down the corridor on the far side of the ward door, she heard it. 2 shots. Suppressed but not silent. The distinctive compressed air pop that people who have never heard it always describe as quiet, and people who have heard it never describe as anything but exactly what it is. The 2 false guards outside room 12. Gone. In the ward, she heard the men waking. The particular sounds of people jolted out of sleep into disorientation. A voice saying, "What was that?" A voice saying, "The power's out." A voice saying, "Somebody get the nurse." Emily moved. She went not toward the door, but away from it toward the supply closet near room 8, and she moved without hesitation with the specific, unhurried speed of someone who has calculated the route in advance and is simply executing it now. She pulled the closet open. In the red emergency light, she could see what she needed. She pulled items from shelves. She moved to the medication cart parked near room 9 and opened the locked drawer with the key that had been on her badge since her first day. In room 5, a Marine named Corporal Hendricks was sitting up in his bed with his hands gripping the rail. "What's happening?" he said. "Nurse, what the hell is happening?" "Stay in your room," Emily said quietly, but with an authority she had not used once in 9 days of being Princess Nurse. "Stay down, stay quiet, stay away from the door and the window." Something in her voice made him do it without arguing. He was back against the head of his bed before she finished the sentence. She heard the ward door open. Not the crash of a forced entry, a deliberate professional open. Someone with a key card or someone who had taken one. 3 men came through. She knew without seeing clearly because she could hear exactly 3 sets of footsteps, the weight distribution and spacing of trained people moving in low light in a coordinated pattern. They were not running. They were moving the way professionals move when they believe they have control of the environment. Emily was already in the maintenance quarter. She pulled the door closed behind her. She was in total darkness, and she was smiling, though there was no one there to see it. From somewhere in the ward, she heard a voice she recognized. Ramirez awake now, loud and furious, and completely unafraid, in the specific way of young men who have been trained to respond to threats with aggression and have not yet fully processed what kind of threat this was. Hey, who the hell are you people?" She heard a blow. She heard a crash. She heard Ramirez swear loud and filthy and unbroken. Good, she thought. Stay loud. Stay angry. Keep them looking at you. She began to move through the maintenance corridor. She was no longer Emily Carter, rookie nurse. She had not been Emily Carter for about 45 seconds now. She was something else entirely. And the men inside that ward had no idea what was coming for them. The maintenance corridor was not built for speed. It was built for utility workers with toolboxes and no particular urgency, and it ran behind the east wall of Ward 7 in a narrow channel of exposed pipes and junction boxes, and the low persistent hum of building systems that never slept even when the floor above them went dark. Emily moved through it in a controlled crouch, her left hand trailing the wall at shoulder height, counting the intervals between pipe clusters, the same way she had counted them in her head for the last 3 hours while sitting at the nurse's station, looking like she was doing absolutely nothing. She had 11 minutes, maybe 12, before the team inside that ward finished their initial sweep and understood that the floor plan had more access points than the briefing they had been given. 11:49. She moved faster. Behind her through the wall, she could hear the ward. It was not chaos yet. It was the sound of controlled intimidation, men using volume and authority to push frightened people into compliance, which meant the team was still in its first phase, still managing the room before moving to the objective. That gave her something. Not much, but something. She stopped at the second junction, the one that ran behind rooms 10 and 11, and put her within 12 feet of the back wall of room 12. She pressed her ear to the pipe conduit and listened. Through the metal, she could feel more than hear the vibration of boot steps, the particular heavy rhythm of men in tactical gear moving with purpose. 2 of them had gone straight to room 12. One was still in the main ward. She needed to change those numbers. She opened the access panel she had identified on day 4 of her shift, the one that maintenance had not properly resecured after a routine inspection, the one she had tested 2 days ago, under the pretense of following up on a patient complaint about a rattling noise in the wall. Behind the panel was a junction for the building's ventilation system, a horizontal channel roughly 18 inches high that ran above the drop ceiling of the corridor outside room 12. She had spent 45 seconds deciding whether she could fit through it. She went in head first. 11:51. Inside room 12, she could hear voices clearly now. Two men speaking in the clipped, reduced language of people working a job. Not excited, not nervous, professional. That was the worst kind. "Sit up," one of them said. "Sit up or I do this differently, and I promise you don't prefer that version." Kincaid's voice strained but intact. "You're making a mistake. Do you understand what I have on record? You kill me, and it doesn't stop anything. That's not I problem." A pause, the sound of something being said on a hard surface, metal on metal, deliberate. "This is a medical facility. People have cardiac events. It happens." Emily positioned herself above the drop ceiling panel directly over the near corner of room 12. She had one item from the medication cart in her right hand and the scalpel she had taken from the supply closet in her left. She had a total of 4 other items secured in her scrub pockets. She had assessed each one of them for utility in the span of about 90 seconds while moving through the supply closet in the emergency, lighting the same assessment process she had run in training so many times, it had stopped requiring conscious thought. She took one breath. She pushed the panel down and dropped. She landed on the first man's back, with both knees driving him straight to the floor, with her full weight behind it, and the sound he made was not a word. Her right hand came around, and the medication she had drawn into the syringe from the cart, a high-dose sedative from the anesthesia supplies she had memorized the location of on day 2, went into the side of his neck before he had processed what was happening to him. 4 seconds and he stopped moving. The second man had his weapon up. Emily was already not where she had been. She had rolled left off the first man's back and come up behind the bed frame, and the shot he fired went into the drop ceiling where she had been half a second before, and then she was moving again around the foot of the bed, low and fast, and he was tracking her. But tracking is always behind when someone moves at the speed of a decision already made, and he was still computing when she came in under his weapon arm and drove the heel of her palm upward into his chin, hard enough to knock his head back into the wall behind him. He slid down the wall and did not get back up. Kincaid had not made a sound through any of it. He sat on the bed with his cast arm pressed against his chest, and his eyes tracking her with an expression that was somewhere between stunned and something that might have been in a different context relief. "2 down," he said. "One more in the ward," Emily said. She was already checking the first man, stripping the radio from his vest. She pressed the earpiece in. Static, and then a voice controlled and impatient. 7 report. 7. She did not answer. 11:54. "You need to get under the bed," she told Kincaid. "My arm. Under the bed. Now, on your back, face up as close to the wall as you can get." Something in her voice did what it had always done to people in the field, cut through their argument, and went straight to the part of the brain that understood this was not a negotiation. He moved. Slowly, painfully, but he moved. She was out the door before it finished closing behind her. The guard at the ward door, the original false federal agent on the left side, was face down in the corridor. She had expected that. The team had neutralized them on entry, which confirmed the 2 inside room 12, and the one managing the ward patients were the primary unit. Lean, efficient, the kind of team that gets brought in for jobs where discovery is not an option. She went back into the maintenance quarter, the radio in her ear. 7, we have a problem on the floor, respond. Then a different voice, the one managing the ward. "Main team, I've got 11 patients, no staff accounted for. There was a nurse on shift. She's not here." A pause, then the first voice again, colder. "Find her. She's a nurse. She's hiding in a closet somewhere. Handle it and move." Emily smiled in the dark of the maintenance corridor and said nothing. She was not in a closet. She was 30 feet behind the man looking for her, moving through the wall. 11:57. She heard Ramirez before she saw him. His voice came through the wall in waves, still loud, still combative, the particular brand of noise that came from a man who was afraid but refused to perform it. She could hear other voices underneath his quieter, tighter. The men who were not Ramirez were managing their fear differently, holding it in, waiting. "I know what you are," Ramirez was saying loudly enough that the man managing the ward had probably told him 3 times to shut up. "I've seen your type before. Contractors. which means somebody's paying you, which means you have got a number in your head, and you're going to do the math on whether it's worth what happens when this is over. A voice Emily did not recognize, flat and without effect. You need to be quiet. Or what? You're going to shoot me in a military hospital. Do you understand how many ways that ends badly for you? Sit down. I'm already sitting down. I've got a fractured femur. What I'm saying is, the sound of a blow, sharp and sudden, and then Ramirez's voice stopped. Emily felt something move through her chest, not panic, something colder and more purposeful than panic. She pushed through the junction and repositioned. 1201. She came out of the maintenance access behind the supply closet near room 8. The man managing the ward was at the far end near the nurse's station, positioned with his back to the window and a line of sight on all the room doors. He was alone. He had a radio in his left hand and a weapon in his right held low, and he was scanning methodically, which meant he was trained and he had not made the mistake of relaxing because the room looked controlled. He had 9 patients in his line of sight and 2 who were out of it in rooms whose doors had been pushed partially closed. Ramirez was one of them in room 5 now, quiet. She needed him away from the center of the ward, away from the patients, into a narrower space where his weapon's range advantage collapsed, and her advantages, speed and angles, and the specific terrain she had spent 9 days memorizing meant something. She opened the supply closet fully just enough to let the hinges creak. One sound in a silent floor. He heard it. She watched through the 3-inch gap as his head turned toward room 8, toward the source of the sound, his body following with the instinctive rotation of a man whose training tells him, investigate and clear. He moved toward her. She let him get close enough to the closet door that she could read the embroidery on his vest patch, and then she opened the door with enough force to catch his weapon hand, and before he completed the redirect, she was inside his guard, and the fight was over in 4 seconds, none of which were comfortable, and one of which she would feel in her left shoulder for days afterward. He went down. She caught him before he hit the floor. She put him down quietly and held her breath for 3 seconds, listening. The ward was silent. Then from room 5, Ramirez's voice came back. Lower this time, scraped raw, but back. Is somebody out there? Emily stood up. She walked to the door of room 5 and pushed it open. Ramirez was on the floor next to his overturned chair. One hand pressed to the side of his face, the other palm flat on the tile, bracing himself. He looked up at her with one eye squinted, nearly shut, blood from a cut above his eyebrow, tracking down the side of his face. And for 1 full second, he did not say a single word, which for Ramirez was extraordinary. You, he said. Me, she said. You just, he stopped, started again. There were 3 of them. 2 are in room 12, she said. This one is in the hallway. He stared at her, his mouth open slightly. She could see him cycling through what he thought he knew about her, sorting it against what he was currently looking at, and watching the moment the 2 versions failed to reconcile. Who are you? He said. Right now I'm the nurse, she said. Can you stand? He pulled himself up, using the bed rail with the particular determination of a man who would drag himself up a cliff face before admitting he could not. He got to standing, tested his leg, once set his jaw against whatever that cost him. What do you need? He said. She had not expected that. Most people in that situation would still be processing. He had gone straight past it to the question that mattered, and she noted it and filed it away. I need you to get every man who can move into the center rooms, she said, away from the far end. Move them quietly, no lights, no noise, close the doors. That's it. That's the first part. He nodded once, already moving. She watched him take 3 steps, favoring the right leg, jaw still set, moving through the ward without hesitation. She had underestimated him. She acknowledged that privately without ceremony and moved on. 12:04. She went back to room 12. Kincaid was still under the bed. The 2 men were still down. She dragged them to the back corner and checked them both, secured their wrists with the IV tubing she had brought from the supply closet. One was going to wake up in the next few minutes. She made an adjustment to his dosage. He was not going to wake up for a while. She keyed the radio. Listen. The voice from outside. Team, we have a timeline issue. Local response is 12 minutes out. Confirm status. 12 minutes. A response she did not want to hear. Main ward clear. Moving to objective. 7 is not responding. They knew. They were sending more. How many coming? Kincaid said from under the bed. His voice was remarkably steady for a man lying on a hospital floor in the dark with 2 unconscious mercenaries 6 feet away. I don't know yet, Emily said. But more. Yes. A pause. You're not scared, he said. It was not exactly a question. Not right now, she said honestly. Why not? She was checking the items on the downed men's vests, stripping what was useful, setting aside what was not. Because being scared means you are thinking about what might happen, she said. I'm only thinking about what is happening. Kincaid said nothing for a moment. Then, I'm scared. I know, she said. That's fine. Stay under the bed. She keyed the radio again and spoke for the first time using the flat professional cadence of someone reporting in. 7 copy. Objective is secure. Moving to extract. A 3-second pause. Then, copy 7, confirm patient status. Patient is stable, she said. Another pause. Longer. Then a different voice. Quieter. More careful. The voice of someone who has just noticed something is wrong but has not yet identified what. 7, confirm authentication. Code. She set the radio down. They would recompute the approach in the next 90 seconds. Change the entry points. Add personnel. Stop taking anything for granted. The next phase was going to be different from the first. She went back to the ward. Ramirez had done exactly what she asked. She found 11 patients redistributed through rooms 6, 7, and 8, the center cluster of the ward beds pushed together and away from doors. 2 men who could not move at all had been carried by Marines who were not supposed to be out of bed and had done it anyway without being told twice. She found Lance Corporal Martinez standing in the doorway of room 7 with a metal IV stand in one hand, looking at her with an expression that was equal parts exhausted and entirely committed. You need help, Martinez said. I need you to stay here and protect this room, Emily said. That stand in your hand is the right idea. If anyone comes through that door who you don't recognize, you use it. He nodded, no hesitation. Behind him, 12 wounded Marines and 1 borrowed IV stand were the only thing between Daniel Kincaid's testimony and the people who needed it buried. Ramirez had positioned himself at the edge of the group back against the wall, one hand gripping the bed rail to take weight off his leg. He looked at her when she came in, and the expression on his face was not anything she had seen from him in 9 days. It was not contempt. It was not mockery. It was not even the bluster he used to cover everything else up. It was focus, clean, uncomplicated, and entirely real. They're sending more, she told the room. Nobody panicked. Nobody argued. She watched 12 men look at each other in the dim emergency light and settle into something steady. Tell us what to do, Ramirez said. She told them. 12:09. The next thing they heard was not gunshots. It was silence. The radio in Emily's hand went dead. Not static, not interference. Total silence, which meant they were not using radio anymore, which meant they were already inside. Martinez looked at her from the doorway. His grip on the IV stand tightened. Down the hall at the far end of the ward, a door opened. Not the main door, a different door, one she had not marked. And in the space of the next heartbeat, Emily Carter understood that somewhere in her 9 days of preparation, she had missed something. The question was, how many of them had come through it? And the answer came in the form of bootsteps, multiple, unhurried, moving in a direction that put them between her and room 12, between her and Kincaid, between her and the exit. She looked at the 12 men behind her. She looked at Martinez in the doorway with his IV stand. She looked at Ramirez against the wall jaw, set every trace of the loud and arrogant sergeant gone, replaced by something harder and quieter and far more useful. She had told them what to do. Now she had to tell them when. She pressed herself flat against the wall beside the door and waited for the footsteps to reach the junction. Her heart rate was 62. She counted. 1, 2, 3. The first man came through the junction, moving fast and low, and Emily let him pass by exactly 1 step before she moved. She came off the wall and hooked her left arm around his throat from behind her right hand, locking the choke with a grip she had practiced until the mechanics of it lived somewhere below. Conscious thought, and she held it through his full resistance, through the backward drive of his elbow that caught her in the ribs hard enough to send a white flash across her vision, through the short, brutal struggle of a trained man who understood what was happening to him and fought it with everything he had. He went down in 9 seconds. She was already looking at the junction. 12:10. 2 more came through simultaneously, 1 high and 1 low, the way you move when you know someone is waiting, which meant they had heard the struggle, which meant she had 3 seconds before the man behind them rounded the far corner and she lost the angle entirely. She threw the radio, not at either of them, past them hard into the wall at the far end of the corridor, where it hit with a sharp crack that pulled both sets of eyes for the quarter second she needed. She went left inside the reach of the closer man and drove her knee up once and her elbow down once and redirected his weapon into the path of the second man's body, and the shot that discharged in the next half second went into the ceiling. The sound of it was enormous in the enclosed corridor, not suppressed, full report bouncing off every hard surface filling the building with the specific violence of a firearm discharged indoors, the kind of sound that changed everything because it removed all pretense and announced to anyone within 2 floors that something irreversible was happening here. The second man recovered faster than she expected. He shoved the first one aside and came at her with the weapon inverted as a strike weapon rather than trying to shoot in the close quarters, which was smart, and she caught the first swing on her forearm and felt the impact run all the way to her shoulder socket, and for 1 full second they were locked in a static contest of strength and angle, with her back to the wall and his full weight driving forward. From room 7, she heard the door hit the wall. Martinez came out of the room at a dead run with the IV stand over his shoulder and hit the second man across the back, with the kind of force that comes from someone who has nothing left to lose and a clear target. The man buckled. Emily finished it. She stood up. Her forearm was screaming. She did not look at it. Martinez was breathing hard, staring at the 2 men on the floor, the IV stand still in his hands. He looked like a man who had just done something he had never expected to do in his life and was only now in the 2 seconds of stillness after it beginning to understand what it cost him. "Go back in the room," Emily said. I know. Go back into the room and close the door." He went, 12:11. The 4th man was still coming. She could hear him at the far end of the corridor, and the fact that he had not rushed through after his team told her something important about him. He had hung back. He had heard the gunshot and the sounds of the fight, and he had stopped and recalculated, which meant he was not a follower. He was a commander. He was the one who made decisions. And commanders were far more dangerous than fighters because they did not act on instinct. They acted on logic. She needed him inside the ward. She needed him away from the exit he had come through, away from whatever communication line he still had open, and she needed him in a space where she controlled the variables. She went back through the ward door. Ramirez looked up immediately. He had positioned himself between 2 beds, his weight on his good leg, a bed frame rail he had somehow removed from the nearest empty bed held in both hands. He looked at her face and read it fast. "How many?" he said. "One more, the one in charge. Where are the others?" "Down." He stared at her for a beat. "All of them. All of them in the corridor," she said. "There may be more on the floor below. I don't know yet." A Marine 2 beds over a staff sergeant named Kowalski, who had not said 5 words to Emily in 9 days, leaned forward from where he was sitting on the floor. "What do you need from us?" "I need the room to sound occupied," she said. "Talking, movement. I need him to think the ward is in disarray. I need him to come through that door believing he still controls this situation." Kowalski looked at the men around him. Nobody argued. Nobody asked why. There was a brief, wordless reorganization of purpose in the room, the specific kind of group recalibration that happens among people who are trained to take orders when orders come from someone who clearly knows what they are doing, regardless of what that person looks like or what their title is. Ramirez tapped the bed frame against his palm once. "Make noise," he said to the room. "Loud, scared, now." The ward filled with sound, voices overlapping the particular texture of frightened men in a confined space. Some of it performed and some of it Emily recognized not performed at all. These men were scared. They were also doing exactly what needed to be done anyway. She positioned herself behind the door. 12:13. She heard him in the corridor. He was moving the way she expected, careful and controlled, one hand on the wall weapon, working toward the source of noise. She could tell by the sound of him that he was good. Not the kind of good that fills a room and intimidates people. The quiet kind. The kind that does not need to announce itself because it has never had to. She had been that kind once. She was still that kind. The door opened inward toward her, which put her behind it, invisible to him, as he came through, and he cleared left and right with the weapon the way you do when you enter a room, but he did not clear behind the door because the door was still moving, and his attention went immediately to the patients in the center of the ward, because they were the only things he could see moving. He got 2 full steps inside before he understood. "Don't," Emily said. He was fast. She gave him full credit for that. He started the pivot immediately, already bringing the weapon around, and she was already moving before the pivot completed inside the arc of the gun, one hand redirecting the barrel up and away from the room, and the other driving into his throat with enough force to interrupt the signal between his brain and his arms. And for a moment, they were very close to each other in the dim red emergency light, close enough that she could see his eyes clearly. He was surprised, not by the attack, by her. He had expected a nurse hiding behind a door, someone using surprise to compensate for everything else she lacked. He had not expected what he found, which was someone standing in front of him who was not compensating for anything. She took the weapon. He let it go, not because he chose to, but because she removed the option. She drove him back against the wall and held him there with the barrel pressed to his sternum and looked at him with the specific flat patience of someone waiting for a decision to be made. "The people who sent you," she said. "What's the extraction protocol when the job fails?" He looked at her, his jaw was tight and his eyes were calculating, and she could see him running options, running timelines, trying to find the version of this where he came out of it with something. "There isn't one," he said finally, which meant he was disposable, which meant the people who had sent him had already accounted for this failure as an acceptable cost and had other moves in place that did not depend on his success or his silence. "How many more?" she said. A pause. "You've already won tonight," he said. "You know that." "How many more?" she said again. His eyes went to the room behind her, to the 12 men watching from the center of the ward, to Ramirez standing 3 feet away with the bed frame in his hands, and the kind of expression that made it clear he was prepared to use it. "2 on the floor below," the commander said. "Watching the exits. They're not coming up unless I call them." "And you're not going to call them," Emily said. "No," he said. "I'm not." She believed him, not because of his character, which she had no particular opinion on, but because the math of his situation had narrowed to a single clear calculation, and he was clearly smart enough to do math. She secured him with his own zip ties, which she had taken from his vest during the struggle, and palmed with the practiced invisibility of someone who has done exactly this kind of thing in far less forgiving environments. 12:16. She stood in the center of Ward 7 and let herself take one full breath. The radio she had dropped when she came back into the ward crackled from the floor near the door, a voice she had not heard before. Not from inside the building, from somewhere outside it. "Commander, we have federal vehicles incoming. ETA 8 minutes. Abort and extract. Repeat, abort and extract 8 minutes. She picked up the radio. She looked at the commander secured against the wall. He met her eyes and said nothing. 8 minutes before federal response arrived meant 8 minutes during which the 2 men on the floor below would decide that no call meant something had gone wrong and would make their own decision about whether to come up or whether to run. She needed to know which kind they were. She also needed to make a call she had been putting off for 26 minutes. She went to the nurse's station and picked up the landline, which ran on its own circuit and had not gone down with the main power. She dialed the number from memory. It rang twice. A voice she knew answered on the second ring, wide awake at 12 in the morning, the way some people always were and always would be. "Status. Compromised facility," she said. "Primary assets secured, 6 neutralized, 2 unknowns on sub-level, federal inbound, and 8. I need confirmation of federal authentication." The initial security detail was staged. A pause of about 2 seconds, which was a long pause for the person on the other end. "Confirmed," the voice said. "Clean team is inbound with the federal response. Look for the blue identification band on the lead vehicle commander. He's ours." "Copy," she said. "Asset status. Alive, intact." Another pause. Shorter. "Well done, Lieutenant Commander." She set the phone down. Behind her from the center of the ward, she heard Ramirez. "Lieutenant Commander," he said slowly, as if testing the words in his mouth for the first time and finding them heavier than he expected. She did not turn around immediately. She stood at the nurse's station for a moment with her hands still on the phone, and she let herself feel just briefly the full weight of the last 30 minutes. The ribs where the elbow had connected, the forearm that had taken the baton strike, the left shoulder that had taken the choke resistance. She cataloged them the same way she had cataloged everything else tonight, efficiently and without drama, assigned each one its appropriate level of concern, which was low, and filed them away for later. Then she turned around. The ward looked different from this angle at this moment than it had in 9 days of shifts. 12 men in hospital gowns, in recovery, bracing, and partial casts and surgical dressings, some of them still on the floor where they had been moved for cover, some of them upright against beds or walls. All of them looking at her with the same expression she had last seen in the field, the expression of people who have been through something together and come out the other side of it and are now in the strange suspended moment before the world closes back in around it. Ramirez had set the bed frame rail down. He was leaning on it now instead of holding it as a weapon, and the cut above his eyebrow had dried to a dark line against his face, and he was looking at her with something she had not seen from him before. Not respect exactly. Not yet. Something more complicated than that. Something that looked like a man revising a version of himself he had been carrying around unchallenged for a long time. "You gonna tell us?" he said. "Or are we just going to stand here?" "Tell you what," she said. "Who you are, what this was, all of it." Emily looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the room, at the faces of 12 men who had fought tonight with what they had because she had asked them to, men with fractured bones and fresh surgical sites, and no obligation to pick up a bed rail or run into a corridor with an IV stand, and who had done it anyway without being asked twice. "My name is Emily Carter," she said. That part was real. "And the rest of it," said Kowalski from the floor. "The rest of it," she said carefully, "is classified." A beat. "Of course it is," Ramirez said. And then unexpectedly, he almost laughed. Not the mocking laugh she had heard for 9 days. Something shorter and more honest than that. Something that came out of genuine disbelief. "Of course it is." 12:19. From the corridor outside, she heard the elevator engage. Every head in the room turned toward the door. She put her hand up, palm out the universal stay signal, and moved to the door herself and put her eye to the narrow gap. The elevator opened. 2 men came out. Not the tactical posture of the team she had handled on the floor. These 2 were moving fast and without precision, the particular movement of people who had been waiting at their post and had just heard a gunshot through the ceiling and were no longer interested in holding their position. They were moving toward the stairwell, not toward the ward. Running. She let them go. She had their description. The clean team would have them before they reached the street. She stepped back from the door. "They're leaving," she said to the room. A sound moved through the ward, not quite relief and not quite anything else, the collective exhale of people who have been holding a breath they did not know they were holding. Someone in the back said something under their breath, and someone else made a short broken sound that was not exactly a laugh and not exactly a sob, and was entirely understandable under the circumstances. Ramirez leaned back against the wall. "I need to sit down," he said with the particular honesty of a man who has just acknowledged something he would normally die before admitting. "Your leg," Emily said. "My everything," he said. She helped him to the nearest bed. She did it the same way she had been doing everything for 9 days, efficiently and without ceremony. And when he was settled, he looked up at her with that revised expression still on his face and said quietly enough that it was just between them, "I owe you an apology." She checked his leg. Stable. No new damage from the weight he had put on it tonight. "You fought when I needed you to," she said. "We're even." He was quiet for a moment. "Princess Nurse," he said. "Sergeant," she said. "That was—" He stopped. Started again. "That was the stupidest thing I ever might have called anyone in my life, wasn't it?" "Probably top 5, she said. He actually laughed that time. A full one. Short and pained and genuine, the kind that costs something to produce but comes out anyway. 12:22, the lights came back on. Not emergency red-orange. Full fluorescent white, the ordinary institutional brightness of a working hospital floor at midnight, flooding every corner and stripping away the particular gravity that darkness gives to things. In the sudden ordinary light, the ward looked like a ward again. Beds and monitors and the residue of a fight, overturned chairs and a scattered crash cart and scuff marks on the floor, but a ward. Not a battlefield, a ward. Several of the men looked at their own hands. One of them looked at the IV still running in his arm that he had somehow kept intact through everything. Martinez came out of room 7 still carrying the IV stand, looked at it, and set it carefully against the wall as if returning it to its proper place. "Is it over?" said a voice from the back. Emily turned toward the ward door. From the corridor through the small window set into the door, She could see the first shapes of moving figures at the far end of the hallway, moving with purpose but not aggression. The first of them held his identification up to the window before he touched the door handle. Blue band on his left wrist. She let them in. The next 4 minutes were the controlled chaos of a response team taking hold of a scene, the particular organized noise of people with specific functions arriving at the same time and finding more than they had expected to find. A medic went immediately to the Marines moving through the ward with practiced speed. 2 agents went to the corridor where she had left the first 3. Another went to room 12. She heard Kincaid's voice from down the hall, still alive, still intact, and let out the breath she had not realized she was holding for the last 12 minutes. The lead agent was a man in his 40s with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that does not give much away on purpose. He stood in the center of the ward and looked at the secured commander against the wall, and at the 6 people down in the corridor, and at the 12 patients, and at Emily, who was standing at the nurse's station in torn blue scrubs with blood on her left sleeve and a bruise forming along her right forearm. He looked at her for a long moment. "You want to tell me what happened here," he said. "In the debrief," she said, "when you have a recorder running." He held her gaze, assessed her the way people assess things they did not expect to encounter and are recalibrating around. "Are you injured?" he said. "Nothing serious," she said. He nodded once. He was going to ask her something else. She could see it forming. The question that everyone in that room had, and none of them had fully asked the one about who she was and what she actually was and how a nurse had done what the evidence in this corridor clearly showed had been done. Before he could ask it, Ramirez spoke from his bed. "She's the best operator in this building," he said, "and she let us call her Princess Nurse for 9 days. He paused. "I'd appreciate it if that last part stayed out of your report." Emily looked at him. He looked back at her with the revised version of himself fully settled in his face now. No performance left in it, no mocking edge, nothing held back. Just a young man in a hospital bed who had spent 9 days being wrong about someone in the most comprehensive way possible and was not interested in pretending otherwise anymore. She did not smile, but it was close, 12:26. Down the hall in room 12, Daniel Kincaid was alive. The testimony that could bring down a senator and dismantle a mercenary network was intact. The mission was complete. Outside the window of Ward 7, Maryland, was dark and cold and entirely ordinary, the way the world always looks from the inside of something that the world outside does not know about yet. Emily stood at the nurse's station. She picked up a chart almost by reflex and then set it back down. The clean team lead appeared at her elbow. "We need to move you," he said quietly. "Cover is compromised." She looked at the ward, at the 12 men, at the medic moving through them, and at Ramirez, watching her from his bed, at Martinez finally putting down the IV stand he had been carrying for the last 15 minutes. 5 minutes, she said. He nodded and stepped back. She stood there in the ordinary fluorescent light of Ward 7, and she let herself have the 5 minutes because some things deserve 5 minutes even when the world is pressing forward and the mission clock has technically ended and the next thing is already waiting. She had come into this ward 9 days ago as someone no one could see. She was leaving it as someone no one in this room would ever forget. The difference, she thought, was not the fight. The difference was the 5 minutes before and after it, when you were just a person standing in the light, knowing what you were worth without anyone having to tell you. She set the chart down for the last time. The 5 minutes ended the way 5 minutes always end, which is faster than you want them to, and slower than the world around you is moving. And when the clean team lead appeared at Emily's elbow a second time, he did not say anything at all, just stood close enough that his presence was the message. She looked one more time at Ramirez. He was watching her. He raised 2 fingers from the bed rail in something that was not quite a salute and not quite a wave and was entirely its own thing, entirely him, and she acknowledged it with the smallest nod she had, and then she walked to the ward door and did not look back again. The corridor was controlled chaos dressed as order. 4 federal agents moving through specific tasks, a forensics pair, working the far end near room 12, the medic from the clean team rotating back toward the main ward after confirming Kincaid's vitals. 2 of the men Emily had left in the corridor were being processed where they lay. The commander she had secured against the wall inside the ward was being walked out by a man in a gray suit who had not introduced himself to anyone and clearly had no intention of doing so. The clean team lead, whose name she had not been given and did not ask for, walked at her left shoulder as they moved toward the elevator. "We have a vehicle downstairs," he said. "Secure transport to the processing facility. Debrief team is already staged." "Who's running the debrief?" she said, a brief pause. "Donnelly." She processed that without changing her expression. Donnelly was thorough and not particularly warm, and had a habit of starting interviews at the conclusion he had already formed and working backward, which made him efficient and occasionally wrong. She had worked with him twice before. Both times she had found him manageable. "How long?" she said. "As long as it takes," he said. "You know how Donnelly is." "I know how Donnelly is," she agreed. 12:31. The elevator opened on the ground floor into a corridor that was not the public-facing entry, a service level that smelled of concrete, and the particular institutional cold of a building's lowest working parts. Two men were already there, positioned at the exterior door, and outside through the reinforced glass she could see the dark shape of a vehicle parked close, engine running, no markings. She stopped walking. The clean team lead stopped beside her. "Problem," he said. "The two from the floor below," she said. "You have them. Both in custody, picked up at the east exit 90 seconds after they ran." He paused. "You let them go on purpose." It was not a question. "I needed them moving toward the exit rather than defending a position," she said. "If they'd made it back upstairs and held a room with a patient in it, the calculus changed." He looked at her the way people look at things they understand intellectually but have not fully absorbed emotionally. "You ran all of that in real time." "That's the job," she said. He held the door. She walked through it. The vehicle moved within 4 seconds of her getting in, which was correct protocol, and also felt in the way these things always feel immediately after an operation, like the world accelerating back to its normal speed after a long period of time during which it had been running at something else entirely. She sat in the back seat and looked at her hands in the passing street light. The bruise on her right forearm had darkened considerably. Her ribs ached with the specific deep persistence of bruised bone rather than broken, which was better than the alternative. The left shoulder was stiff but functional. She was intact. She had walked into Ward 7 9 days ago as Emily Carter, rookie nurse. She was walking out of it as herself. The distance between those two things felt at this particular moment very large. 12:44. The processing facility was a federal building 20 minutes outside the hospital perimeter, the kind of place that exists on no public directory and whose address is a suite number on a form that gets filed under a code name in a system that requires 3 levels of clearance to access. She had been in buildings like it before. They all smelled the same: recycled air and burnt coffee, and the particular tension of people doing serious work in rooms without windows. She was put in an interrogation room at 12:56. She had expected this. She had expected the bare table and the 2 chairs and the mirror that was not a mirror, and the slight overcooling of the air that was either a mechanical issue or a deliberate choice, and probably both. She had expected to wait. She had been in rooms like this before, and the waiting was always part of it, the first calibration, the check of how someone sits with silence before you go in and start asking them to fill it. She sat with it fine. She sat with it the way she sat with most things, which was quietly and without performance. It was not Donnelly who came through the door. She heard the footsteps in the corridor before the door opened, and she identified 2 sets of them. The particular weight and spacing of 2 people who walk together, the way people who have worked together for a long time walk together, matched without trying to match. She had the door cataloged before it moved. The first person through it was Donnelly. 52, gray at the temples, a face that had long ago decided not to waste energy on expressions it didn't mean. He carried a folder and set it on the table and sat down across from her and looked at her the way he always looked at people in rooms like this, with the comprehensive appraisal of a man who has already decided you are interesting, but has not yet decided whether that is good or bad. The second person through the door stopped her breath for exactly 1 second. Rear Admiral Michael Harrington, Commander Naval Special Warfare. Not a man who appeared in interrogation rooms at federal processing facilities 1 in the morning for routine debriefs. Not a man who left his desk and his command for anything short of something that genuinely warranted his direct and personal presence. He was 60 years old and built like someone who had been testing himself against hard things for 4 decades and had not once found himself insufficient. He stood just inside the door and looked at Emily with the particular expression she had seen from him exactly twice before, once when she had completed selection, and once when she had returned from an operation that no one outside the room had ever been told happened. It was not quite pride, it was the expression of someone who had believed something about a person for a long time and had just received definitive confirmation that they had been right. He did not sit down. Donnelly opened the folder. He looked at it for a moment and then looked back up at her. "Let me be direct," Donnelly said. "We have 6 individuals in custody. We have a witness who is alive and documented. We have a hospital floor with evidence of what I would generously describe as an extremely active evening." He paused. "And we have you, who are officially a first-year nurse at Walter Reed, with no military record, no special operations background, and no documented reason to be able to do any of the things that the physical evidence in that building suggests were done tonight." He let that sit for a moment. "So," he said, "talk to me." Emily looked at Donnelly. She looked at the Admiral standing by the door. She placed her hands flat on the table. "I'd like the record to reflect," she said, "that I was hit in the ribs and would appreciate someone looking at that before the debrief runs long." Donnelly blinked once. "Noted. And I'll need a full statement from the facility coordinator who processed Kincaid's transfer. The man who called himself Brent Merritt, his identification was fabricated." "We know," Donnelly said. "He was detained at the facility 40 minutes ago. How did you make him?" "The way he held his name tag," she said, "and he used the word federal as a noun without a following noun, which people who are actually federal agents never do. They always say federal agent or federal officer. People performing being federal agents say it's a federal matter because they've heard it in films." Donnelly looked at his folder. "You identified a compromised security asset from his grammar. And his lanyard," she said. "It was too new." A pause that lasted approximately 3 seconds and contained a considerable amount of information within it. "The stage security detail," Donnelly said. "Walk me through when you first assessed it as compromised." "When they arrived," she said, "the 2 flanking the gurney were positioned for surveillance of the corridor, not protection of the patient. Protection positions face toward the asset. Surveillance positions face away. They were watching for response, not threat." She walked him through it from there. The arrival, the whispered warning from Kincaid, the preparation, the timeline. She spoke in the flat, precise cadence of a formal debrief, the language of someone documenting an operation rather than telling a story, because that was what this was, and she respected the distinction. Donnelly asked good questions. She had always given him that. He asked them quickly and followed the threads without losing the main line, and he did not flinch at the answers, even when the answers described things that were difficult to hear in a room with fluorescent lighting and a recording device on the table. At 1:43 in the morning, he closed the folder. He looked at her for a long moment. "The mercenary commander," he said, "the one you took alive in the ward. He's talking." Emily kept her expression level. "What is he saying?" "He's saying the operation was contracted through a private network that traces 2 levels up to an office in the city that has a significant interest in Kincaid not reaching a courtroom." Donnelly's voice was careful and deliberate. "He's also saying something that concerns me more than the network itself." A pause. "He said he was briefed that the hospital security was minimal. 1 federal detail, no additional assets, no specialized personnel." Donnelly looked at her. "Which means whoever staged that security detail and fed the briefing to the hit team believed exactly what the rest of the hospital believed about you." Emily said nothing. "Which means," Donnelly continued, "that your cover held completely for 9 days in a facility with federal oversight against people who vet their targets carefully." He paused again. "That is either very impressive or it means you are very good at being invisible." "Both, usually," she said. Admiral Harrington, who had not spoken since entering the room, moved for the first time. He came to the table and pulled out the second chair and sat down. The shift in the room was immediate. Donnelly recalibrated around it without a word. Some people, when they enter a room, change the weight distribution of it, and Harrington was one of those people, had been for as long as Emily had known him. "There is something you don't know yet," Harrington said. His voice was even and precise and carried the particular quality of someone about to deliver information they have been holding until the right moment. "The senator." She waited. "He knew about you," Harrington said. The words landed without drama, which made them land harder. "He knew about the protection detail," Harrington continued. "Not your specific identity, but he knew there was a classified asset embedded in that hospital alongside Kincaid, which is why the team was sent in with the size they were. which is why the commander you took alive was authorized to use lethal force on hospital staff. Emily processed this with the stillness of someone who has received bad news in field conditions and knows that the processing has to happen underneath the surface quietly and fast without affecting the next decision. Then the leak is inside the program, she said. Yes, Harrington said, a silence that was not comfortable and was not meant to be. How deep, she said. We don't know yet, he said, which is why you were not told before tonight. We didn't know how many people we could trust with your position. He held her gaze. I'm sorry for that. She looked at him. I'm alive, she said. Kincaid is alive. The apology isn't necessary. It is, he said quietly. You went in without full information because we were protecting the operation from a leak we hadn't identified yet. That's not how we do this, and I owe you that acknowledgement directly. The room was very quiet. Donnelly looked at his closed folder as if examining something on the cover. Emily looked at the Admiral and let the acknowledgement settle, and then she nodded once the way you nod when something that needed to be said has been said, and both parties understand that it is now resolved and the next thing is in front of you. What do you need from me? She said. 149. What they needed, it turned out, was considerable. The debrief ran for another 2 hours, not because Emily was slow or reluctant, but because the information she had accumulated over 9 days of apparent inactivity was more complete than either Donnelly or Harrington had anticipated. Details of the false security detail, the communication patterns she had observed, the specific timeline discrepancies in the hospital's administrative records around Kincaid's transfer, the grammar tells in the lanyard, and 20 other small things she had cataloged without being asked to, because cataloging was something she did the way other people breathed. At 3:47 in the morning, Donnelly closed his recorder. He looked at her one more time with the expression of a man who has been doing this work for 25 years and does not easily reach the end of what he has seen, but is currently close to it. I'm going to be honest, he said. When Harrington told me what you had been doing in that hospital, I thought he was overstating it. She waited. He was not overstating it, Donnelly said. Thank you, she said. That was not a compliment, he said. It was an admission. He stood up and gathered his folder. I don't give those easily. I want that noted for the record. He left the room. Harrington stayed. For a moment, they sat in the quiet of a room at 4 in the morning, the specific quiet of the end of something, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her since he had come through the door with that confirmed belief expression that she had seen from him twice before. I need to ask you something, he said. Akio. The Marines in that ward, he said, were they a liability or an asset tonight? She thought about Martinez coming out of room 7 at a dead run with an IV stand. She thought about Ramirez on the floor with blood on his face looking up at her and asking, what do you need? She thought about Kowalski, who had not spoken to her in 9 days, leaning forward in the emergency light and saying, tell us what to do. Asset, she said without hesitation. Harrington nodded slowly. They're going to ask questions, he said. The hospital will be briefed with a cover story. Classified incident, federal investigation details restricted. They'll be told not to discuss it. They'll discuss it, she said. They will, he agreed, quietly, among themselves, the way those men do. He paused. Is that a problem? She thought about what those men had seen tonight and what they were going to carry with them from it, and whether the version they told each other in quiet would be better or worse for them than the official silence. No, she said, let them have it. They earned it. 4:01. A medic came in at Donnelly's written instruction and looked at her ribs, which were bruised across the left lateral cage and nothing more, and wrapped her forearm, which had a bone bruise that was going to be visible and uncomfortable for 10 days and then gone, and told her she had been lucky. She thanked him and meant it genuinely, and he left, looking slightly uncertain about what he had been expecting from her, which was fine. Harrington waited through all of it. When the medic was gone, he looked at the wrapped forearm and said nothing for a moment, and then said Emily. It was the first time he had used her first name in the building. He was a formal man, and she had always appreciated it, and the departure from it now meant something specific. The leak investigation is going to take time, he said. Weeks, possibly months. Until it is resolved, your current identity is burned, all of it. The nursing credentials, the Walter Reed placement, the cover story. He paused. You'll go dark, reassignment, new placement, new background. You know the process. She knew the process. There's something else, he said. She waited. The senator's legal team is going to move fast once the network is exposed, he said. They're going to attack the chain of evidence from every angle. Kincaid's testimony is strong, but it's one voice. What you documented in that hospital over 9 days, the administrative irregularities, the communication pattern, the false credentials of the security detail, those are corroborating evidence threads that a good prosecutor is going to need. He looked at her carefully. That means your cover being fully burned is not just an operational problem. It's a legal one. At some point, there is going to be a proceeding that requires a real name and a real face. The weight of that was not small. Going dark was one thing. Going dark while knowing that at some indefinite future point you would be asked to step back into the light under your actual identity in a public proceeding in front of people who had reasons to want you. Silent was a different calculation entirely. How public, she said. Unknown yet, he said. Could be closed chamber, could be open court, depends how far this goes. She looked at the wall for a moment, not avoiding him, thinking. Then it depends how far this goes, she said. He nodded. The senator, she said. What's his name? Harrington told her. She sat with that for a moment, with the name of the man who had authorized a hit squad to enter a military hospital and execute a wounded witness and leave no one alive to contradict his version of events, who had known there was a classified asset embedded in that ward and had sent his people in anyway, who had looked at 12 recovering Marines as acceptable collateral and had written the calculation without apparent difficulty. She thought about the men in Ward 7, about the ones who had been asleep when the lights went out and had woken to gunshots, about Martinez and his IV stand, about Ramirez on the floor, blood on his face, asking, "What do you need?" Is Kincaid going to testify? She said. He's already agreed, Harrington said. He agreed before they moved him tonight, before he knew the operation had been compromised. That's the kind of man he is. She thought about Kincaid under the bed in room 12, speaking in the dark, with that voice scraped raw with pain and something close to fear telling her they were coming tonight. Not asking for help, just making sure someone knew. Then we give him what he needs to finish it, she said. 4:14. Harrington stood up. He straightened his jacket, the habitual small gesture of a formal man preparing to be seen. He looked at her one last time across the table, and then he did something she had not expected and had not prepared for, and which later she would think about in the quiet of whatever room she was assigned to next. He came to attention, full military attention, the clean vertical line of a man with 40 years of service in his spine, and he held it for exactly 3 seconds, looking at her with a confirmed belief expression, fully open now, nothing held back in it. Then he stood at ease and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle. "Get some rest, Lieutenant Commander," Benny said. "You've got work to do." He opened the door and went through it. She sat alone in the room with the hum of the building around her and the ache in her ribs and the particular exhaustion that comes not from exertion, but from the sustained compression of being two people at once for a long time, and finally for a few minutes being only one. She thought about the ward, about the ordinary fluorescent light and the smell of antiseptic and old coffee and the weight of 12 men in hospital gowns who had been through the worst night of their recoveries and had come through it intact. She thought about the chart she had set down for the last time. She thought about Ramirez. She thought about what he had said to the federal agent with blood drying on his face and a fractured femur and the bed rail still in his hands. "She's the best operator in this building, and she let us call her Princess Nurse for 9 days. She almost smiled. The room was quiet. The senator had a name now, and a name meant a target, and a target meant a direction. And direction was what she needed most in the particular stillness after an operation when the mission clock has ended and the world has not yet told you what comes next. She was not afraid of what came next. She had never been afraid of what came next. What she was sitting in a federal interrogation room at 4 in the morning, with wrapped ribs and a medic's note in the Admiral's salute still processing somewhere inside her, was ready. She always had been. She pressed her hands flat on the table, pushed herself to standing, and walked to the door. Behind her, the recording device sat on the table and the folder was gone, and the room held nothing but the recycled air and the coffee smell and the residue of everything that had been said in it. She walked out into the corridor. The building was moving around her people, doing their jobs in the specific, purposeful way that happens in the hours before dawn when the work is real and the stakes are clear. She moved through them without disrupting anything the way she had always moved, with the economy of someone who takes up exactly the space they intend to and no more. At the end of the corridor, through a window, she could see the sky beginning to separate from black into the deep blue glow that comes just before the light. Not morning yet. The hour between what happened and what comes next. She stopped at the window for exactly 5 seconds. Then she turned away from it and went toward the work. At 4:22, a woman Emily did not recognize came to the corridor and handed her a clean set of clothes, a black bag with a combination lock, and a temporary identification that had her photograph on it and a name she had not been given before. She looked at the name for exactly 2 seconds, committed it to memory, and clipped the ID to her collar. The woman who had delivered these things was young and efficient and had the eyes of someone who understood precisely what she was part of and had no interest in discussing it. She said vehicle in 7 minutes, Bay 3, and walked away without waiting for acknowledgement. Emily changed in the single-stall bathroom at the end of the corridor, moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has done this transition enough times that it no longer carries weight in the moment. Different clothes, different name, same person. The medic's wrap on her forearm was visible below the sleeve, and she pulled the sleeve down over it and noted the stiffness in her shoulder and put both things in the part of her mind reserved for things she was managing rather than solving. 7 minutes later, she was in Bay 3. The vehicle that pulled up was not the same as the one from the hospital. This one was smaller and moved without the deliberate, unhurried authority of a federal transport. This was something more anonymous, the kind of vehicle that disappears into traffic because it wants to and knows how. The driver was the clean team lead from the hospital. He had not slept. His eyes showed it, but his bearing did not the particular quality of trained people who have learned to hold their fatigue below the visible line. She got in. Where, she said. Harrington wants you at the secure briefing at 0600, he said. Until then, you have 90 minutes. I need to go back to the hospital, she said. He looked at her in the rearview mirror. Cover is burned, he said. I know what my cover is, she said. I'm not going back as Emily Carter. I'm going back as myself. A pause. Harrington authorized this, she said. It was not entirely a lie. Harrington had said the Marines had earned the right to carry what had happened. She was choosing to interpret that with some latitude. The clean team lead was quiet for 3 seconds. 15 minutes, Peter said. I stay with the vehicle. That's fine, she said. 4:41. Ward 7 at Walter Reed at 4:41 in the morning was not the same ward it had been 9 days ago. And it was not the same ward it had been 6 hours ago. It was a ward that had been through something and was now sitting in the aftermath of it, the way places and people sit in the aftermath of things in a particular suspended state that is not quite normal and not quite emergency and has its own very specific texture. She knew that texture. She had lived in it many times. She came through the stairwell door in civilian clothes, her temporary ID on her collar, moving with a directness that communicated purpose and would, in a facility like this, cause most people to assume she had somewhere to be and stood of the way. At the nurses' station on Ward 7, Dana Cho was on shift. She was standing at the station with the expression of someone who had been briefed by federal agents 3 hours ago and told to keep everything normal and was finding the instruction considerably harder in practice than it had sounded in theory. She looked up when Emily came through the stairwell door, and for a moment her face ran through 4 different expressions in rapid succession: recognition, confusion, something close to relief, and then a complicated, arrested quality that was trying to assemble what it was seeing into a coherent picture. Emily, Dana said. Hey, Emily said. A pause. They told us it was a federal incident, Dana said carefully. They said not to discuss it. You should follow that instruction, Emily said. I just need 5 minutes with the ward. Dana looked at her for a long moment at the civilian clothes and the ID and the wrapped forearm and whatever it was in Emily's face that she was reading, and then she nodded once and looked back at her station and became very interested in the chart in front of her. Emily pushed the ward door open. The lights were still on the full fluorescent ordinary light that had come back at 12:22 and stayed. The ward had been partially straightened by someone from the response team, the crash cart repositioned, the floor cleared of the most visible evidence of the night. The beds in rooms 6, 7, and 8 had been redistributed back to their original positions. The IV stand Martinez had carried was back against the wall where it belonged. Most of the men were awake. She suspected most of them had not slept. The ones closest to the door saw her first. She watched it move through the room, the recognition, the stillness, the particular attention that settles over a group of people when something they have been processing in the abstract is suddenly standing in front of them in the concrete. Ramirez was sitting up in his bed. The cut above his eyebrow had been closed with a butterfly strip by the medic from the response team, and his leg was re-elevated, and his face had the gray undertone of someone running on zero sleep in a lot of pain, but his eyes were sharp and completely alert, the kind of alert that comes from the brain refusing to stand down even when the body is asking it to. He saw her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her from his bed when Harrington had walked through the interrogation room door, the way you look at something that keeps revising your understanding of it in the look. This time had an additional quality, something close to recognition of a kind that was less about her and more about himself, about what the last 9 days of his behavior now looked like from the far side of what he knew. Emily walked to the center of the ward. She did not stand at the nurse's station. She stood in the middle of the floor, the same place she had stood at 12:22 when the lights came back on, and she looked at the room. "I'm not here officially," she said. "I have about 5 minutes. I wanted to see how everyone was doing before I left." "Left?" said Martinez from room 7's doorway. "Left where?" "I can't tell you that," she said. Kowalski, sitting on the edge of his bed with his arms on his knees, looked at her steadily. "Are you going to be okay?" he said. The question caught her slightly off guard, not because it was unexpected in the abstract, but because of the specific person asking it, the man who had said 5 words to her in 9 days and had chosen these 5 for the first ones that mattered. "Yes," she said and meant it. "Kincaid Bear," said a Marine named Flores from room 6, a corporal recovering from a lower back surgical repair who had spent 3 hours on the floor of room 7 and had not complained once. "Is he going to be all right?" "He's alive," Emily said. "He's going to testify. The rest is going to take time, but yes, he's going to be all right." Flores nodded once and looked at his hands. 4:44. Ramirez had not spoken yet. She was aware of that. The whole room was aware of it in the specific way that rooms are aware of the loudest person being quiet. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I've been sitting here," he said, "for the last 3 hours trying to figure out what to say to you." "You don't have to say anything," she said. "Yeah, I do," he said, "because I spent 9 days being an absolute problem, and that would have been bad enough if you were just a nurse, but you were—" He stopped. He pressed his jaw tight for a moment. "Do you even know how to be a nurse? Like, actually?" "I'm licensed," she said. "I went through the full program. It was a 2-year assignment." "You spent 2 years becoming a nurse," he said slowly, "so you could spend 9 days pretending to be a bad one." "A mediocre one," she corrected. "Not bad, mediocre. Bad would have been conspicuous." Ramirez stared at her. Then the laugh came out of him, the same one from before, short and genuine and slightly broken, and it was the right laugh for the moment, the laugh of a man who has run out of armor and found that what is underneath it is against his own expectations, not as bad as he feared. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I already said that. I'm saying it again." "I heard you the first time," she said. "I'm saying it again because the first time was in the dark and there was blood on my face, and I need you to hear it when I'm not in shock." He met her eyes directly, no deflection, no performance. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong every day for 9 days in every way a person can be wrong about another person, and I was loud about it, and I'm sorry." Emily looked at him for a long moment. Something passed through her chest that was not quite what she expected to feel. Not vindication, which she had not needed. Not forgiveness, which was not something that required a formal transfer in this kind of exchange. Something simpler and less nameable than either the recognition of a person choosing honesty when it cost them something, which was not nothing. "You fought when it mattered," she said. "Everything before that was just Tuesday." He held her gaze. His jaw worked once. He nodded. "You're going to be fine," she told him. "The leg is healing correctly. Another 4 weeks and you'll be weight-bearing without the brace." "You actually were checking my vitals," he said. "Every single time," she said. 4:47. She looked at the whole room once more, at the 12 faces, some of them showing the specific raw-edged quality of men who have been through something and have not yet had time to decide what to do with it. Some of them showing a quieter version of the same thing, and she let herself hold that image for the 3 seconds she allowed herself. "I need to go," she said. No one argued. Kowalski stood up from the edge of his bed. He was not the kind of man who made gestures. She had established that in 9 days of observation, and so when he came to attention, the clean military attention of a man with 8 years of service in his spine, it landed with the weight of something chosen carefully rather than performed automatically. Martinez came to attention from the doorway. Flores stood from his bed slowly, carefully, with the deliberate care of a man with a recent surgical repair, and came to attention. One by one, in the particular quiet of 4:47 in the morning in Ward 7, every Marine who could stand came to attention. The ones who could not stand sat at attention. Ramirez, with his fractured femur and his re-elevated leg and the butterfly strip above his eyebrow, pushed himself to the edge of his bed and sat straight and brought his hand up in a salute that had more in it than the gesture itself, more than protocol and more than formality and more than everything that had come before it all. 9 days in the long impossible night, and the morning after it that was still not quite morning yet. Emily held it for a moment. Then she brought her hand up and returned it. She held it for exactly 3 seconds, the way Harrington had held it in the interrogation room, with everything present and nothing performed, and then she dropped it and turned and walked through the ward door. She did not look back. She had learned a long time ago that looking back from a departure does something to both people that leaving cleanly does not, and she had learned to value the clean, leave the kind that says, I was here, and now I am going, and both of those things are complete. 4:49. Dana Cho was still at the nurse's station when she came back through. She looked up once, and then back at her chart, and then she looked up again and said quietly, and with a precision that suggested she had been carefully selecting the words for the last 8 minutes, whatever you did tonight, I just want you to know, all of them are okay, every single one. Emily stopped walking. She looked at Dana at the dark circles and the third cup of coffee, in the face of someone who had been on this floor for years, who had driven out by 2 previous nurses by Ramirez's brand of treatment, and had warned Emily on day 1 that the ward was going to eat her alive. Thank you, Emily said, for the warning on day 1. Dana looked at her steadily. Did it help? More than you know, Emily said honestly. Dana nodded once. Something small passed across her face, not quite a smile. The look of a person who has just found out that something they did mattered and is receiving that information with appropriate quiet. Emily walked back through the stairwell door. 4:51. The vehicle was still in Bay 3. The clean team lead had the engine running and said nothing when she got in, which was the correct response and one she appreciated. They drove in silence through streets that were just beginning to carry the first thin traffic of early morning delivery vehicles and the occasional long-distance runner, and the specific quiet of a city not yet fully awake. At 5:04, her phone, the new one that had been in the black bag, vibrated. She looked at the message. 4 words. Kincaid is in debrief. She put the phone in her pocket. At 5:19, the vehicle stopped outside a building she had not been to before, and the clean team lead turned and handed her a folder over the seat. From Harrington, he said, for the 0600. She took it. The folder was thin. Inside was a single sheet with her next assignment. She did not recognize the city on the header, but she recognized the operation type, the particular combination of words and classification levels that described the kind of work she had been doing for 4 years, the kind of work that required a person who could be invisible and capable at the same time, and who understood that those 2 things were not in conflict, but were in fact each other. She read it twice. She closed the folder. You're not going to tell me anything about it, the clean team lead said. He said it like a statement, not a question, which showed good judgment. No, she said. She 23. The briefing at 0600 ran 40 minutes. Harrington was there. Donnelly was there. 2 people Emily did not recognize were there, which she noted and accepted without comment. The information in the room was dense and moved quickly, the particular momentum of an operation shifting from its completed phase into its next, and Emily tracked it with the specific focused attention of someone building a new map while the old one was still warm. The senator's legal team had moved overnight exactly as Harrington had predicted. 3 motions filed before dawn. A public statement released at 5 in the morning framing Kincaid as an unreliable witness with a personal grievance. The particular machinery of power defending itself, which was not subtle but did not need to be because it had resources that did not require subtlety. Kincaid's debrief is running parallel, Donnelly said from across the table. His testimony is detailed and corroborated. The documentation Emily compiled during her placement covers 4 of the 7 evidentiary threads we need. That is not a small contribution. He said her actual name without looking at her the way you say a name when you have been calling someone something else for the duration of a case and are adjusting to the real version. Harrington looked at her from the head of the table. The leak investigation is active. We have 3 candidates under surveillance. We expect to narrow it within 48 hours. Until then, one of the unrecognized people said, full operational silence on the new placement. No contact with the previous cover identity or anyone associated with it. Understood, Emily said. Including the hospital, the person said, looking at her steadily. A beat. Understood, she said again. 5 meanings inside of those 48 minutes, all of them pointing the same direction. The work was not finished. It had never been about one night. It had always been about the chain of events that the night was part of the testimony, in the network and the senator, in the proceeding that would eventually require a real name and a real face in a room where people would be looking for a reason to discredit both. She was one piece of something larger. She had always been one piece of something larger. The difference this morning was that the people in the room with her knew what kind of piece she was. 6:47. After the briefing in the corridor outside, Harrington stopped her one more time. He stood in the particular way he stood, with 40 years of service held in a posture that was neither stiff nor soft, but simply present, and he looked at her with the expression she had now cataloged clearly enough to read fully. The senator is going to make this as difficult as possible, he said. Yes, she said. When it goes to proceeding, when they call you, it is going to be public. Your name, your record, everything that has been classified will be declassified in that context. Everything you have been will be visible. He paused. I need to know you understand what that means for the work you do after it. She held his gaze. It means I do the work differently, she said. Not that I stopped doing it. He looked at her for a long moment. There are people in this building, he said slowly, who have done one extraordinary thing and spent the rest of their careers describing it. There are others who do the work every day without a single moment anyone outside this corridor will ever know about. He paused. You have now done both. I was just doing the job, she said. That is exactly what I mean, he said. He stepped back. The morning was full around them now. The building fully operational at this hour, people moving in both directions with the momentum of a workday that had been going since before dawn. Get some sleep before your transport, he said. I'll sleep on the plane, she said. He almost smiled. I know you will, he said. That's what concerns me. He walked away, 7:02. She had 3 hours before the transport. She spent 40 minutes of them sleeping in a chair in a room that had been set aside for her use, the particular sleep of a trained person who has learned to enter and exit it at will without transition, the way some people turn a light switch on and off. She woke at the precise time she had told herself to wake, which was a skill she had acquired in the first year of her training and had never lost. She spent another 30 minutes reviewing the folder Harrington had given her in the vehicle building, the first architecture of what came next in the part of her mind that was already moving forward, because moving forward was the only direction she had ever found useful. She spent the remaining time thinking about the ward. She thought about 12 men in hospital gowns, in the emergency red-orange of battery backup, and Martinez with his IV stand, and Kowalski leaning forward in the dark and asking, what do you need? She thought about Ramirez at attention on the edge of his bed with a butterfly strip on his face and everything performed and nothing left in the salute except the real thing. She thought about the nurse they had called Princess Nurse for 9 days and mocked with the comfortable casualness of people who believe they know exactly what they are looking at. She thought about what it costs a person to carry a real self in a pocket where nobody can see it, to walk through a room every day as the version of yourself that others have decided you are to check their vitals and replace their IV bags and endure the names and never once let the seams show. She thought about what it had felt like in the maintenance corridor at 11:51 with the building's power cut and the ward going to red light in her heart rate at 62 to finally become what she actually was. Not relief. She had examined that possibility and ruled it out. Something closer to alignment. The feeling of a thing snapping back to true after a period of deliberate distortion. She had been Emily Carter for 9 days. Emily Carter was gone now. Lieutenant Commander Emily Carter was not gone. She would stand in a courtroom when the time came, in front of cameras and opposing counsel, in the machinations of a man who had sent people into a military hospital to kill a wounded witness. And she would say what she had seen and what she had done and what she knew. And she would say it with the same flat patience she brought to everything. And it would be enough, because the truth done cleanly is always enough. But before that, before the courtroom and the proceeding and the next assignment waiting in the folder on the table beside her, there was this moment. There was the chair in the quiet room, and the morning outside the window she could not see from where she was sitting, and the building humming around her with the work of people who understood what the work cost and did it anyway. There was the memory of 12 men coming to attention in the half-dark of a ward that had been 24 hours ago the most ordinary place in a military hospital. She had gone into that ward as someone no one could see. She had come out of it having shown 12 people something true, not about herself, but about what it means to carry something real without announcement, to do the work, without the performance of doing the work, to be the thing rather than the performance of the thing. 9:51. Her transport call came at 9:58. She picked up the black bag and the folder and walked out of the room and down the corridor toward the bay entrance, and did not hesitate and did not look back and did not need to, because looking back was for people who had not finished, and she had finished this part completely. She had come in as the quiet one. She had walked out as herself. And in Ward 7 at Walter Reed, in the beds of 12 Marines who would spend years after this telling the story, in the particular quiet way those men tell true stories, the lesson had already taken root, the one you cannot teach in a classroom or a briefing room or any room where the stakes are not real. Never assume that the quietest person in the room is the smallest one. Never mistake invisibility for absence. Because sometimes the woman who checks your vitals and replaces your IV bags and endures your names without a word is the one person in the building who, when the lights go out and the shots come and everything you thought was safe is suddenly not, stands between you and what is coming. And she was always ready. She had just been waiting for you to need her to be.